much more mellow now, and we value one another's friendship, you know?
You gone softer?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah. In some ways, harder
There
in
are
others.
friendships that history remembers cleanly, and then there are friendships so tangled in love, guilt, music, and forgiveness that no biographer has ever quite captured them. This is one of those friendships. Eric Clapton is 80 years old. He has survived heroin addiction, alcoholism, the death of his son, and the death of the man who was perhaps the greatest friend he ever had. And for decades, he has carried a story that the world only knows pieces of. Tonight, we put the full picture together. This is the truth about Eric Clapton and George Harrison, not the tabloid version, not the Wikipedia summary. The real story. December 1964. London. Hammersmith Odeon. The Beatles are performing their annual Christmas show, the hottest ticket in Britain. Outside, fans are screaming so loud the windows shake. Inside, a 20-year-old guitarist from Surrey stands with wings, waiting to go on as a support act with his band, the Yardbirds. His name is Eric Clapton. He is not yet a legend. He is not yet God. That graffiti won't appear on the London Underground for another year. He is just a skinny kid with extraordinary hands and an obsessive relationship with the blues. And somewhere backstage, adjusting his Rickenbacker, is George Harrison, 21 years old, the youngest Beatle, the quiet one, the one always standing slightly to the left in the photograph, letting Lennon and McCartney fill the frame. Nobody recorded the exact moment they met, but those who knew both men say the connection was immediate. Two guitarists who spoke the same unspoken language. Two introverts surrounded by louder personalities. Two men who felt music more deeply than they could ever express in words. George Harrison had Lennon and McCartney as bandmates, two of the greatest songwriters in human history. But Eric Clapton saw George. And George Harrison would spend the rest of his life remembering that. From that night forward, their lives would be intertwined in ways neither of them could have predicted. Through studios and stadiums, through a woman they both loved, through addiction and recovery, through grief and laughter and music that would outlast them both. For years past, it is now 1968. The Beatles are the most famous band on the planet, and they are quietly destroying each other. The sessions for what will become the White Album are poisonous. John Lennon is emotionally absent, consumed by his new relationship with Yoko Ono. Paul McCartney is controlling, perfectionistic, increasingly difficult. The studio feels less like a creative space and more like a courtroom. And George Harrison is always on trial. His songs are dismissed. His ideas are talked over. Lennon would later admit, with painful honesty, that there had been an embarrassing period when George's songs weren't that good. McCartney privately agreed. But here's what they missed. George Harrison was growing, quietly, relentlessly, the way all truly great artists grow, without fanfare, without anyone watching. And he had written something extraordinary, While My Guitar Gently Weeps. A meditation on love, on disappointment, on the gap between how the world is and how it ought to be. Musically sophisticated, emotionally devastating, a masterpiece by any measure. And George Harrison knew it, which is exactly why he did something no Beatle had ever done. He picked up the phone and called Eric Clapton. "I want you to play the lead guitar," Harrison told him. Clapton's response was immediate. "I can't do that. Nobody ever plays on Beatles records." Harrison didn't argue. He didn't beg. He simply said, "I want you there. Just come." So Clapton came. What happened next is one of the most quietly significant moments in rock history. Clapton walked into Abbey Road Studios, the most exclusive recording space in the world, belonging to the most famous band in the world, and he played. That solo, you know it. Even if you don't know, you know it. That weeping, bending, aching guitar line that rises and falls like a human voice on the edge of tears. But here's what the history books don't always tell you. Harrison didn't just invite Clapton for the music. He invited him as a statement. Because when Eric Clapton walked through that studio door, something shifted in the room. Lennon and McCartney, who had been dismissive, distracted, difficult, suddenly straightened up, suddenly became professional. Harrison later recalled that his bandmates began to act more handsomely the moment Clapton arrived. George Harrison had brought a witness, a mirror, a reminder that the outside world was watching, and that his songs were worth taking seriously. It worked, and from that day forward, no one in that studio or anywhere else would ever again casually dismiss a George Harrison song. Her name was Pattie Boyd. She was a model. She was magnetic. She had met George Harrison on the set of A Hard Day's Night in 1964, and they had married in January 1966. She was by every account a remarkable woman, warm, intuitive, creative, and deeply loved by two of the greatest musicians who ever lived. Eric Clapton first saw her at a party, and something in him, something he would later describe as almost irrational, almost frightening in its intensity, simply broke open. He began writing her letters. Long, passionate, desperate letters that a married man should never send to another married man's wife. She tried to ignore them. She tried to stay away. But Clapton was relentless. Not in a predatory way, but in the way of a man who has decided that one particular feeling is the most important feeling he has ever had. Then he wrote Layla. If you have ever heard Layla, the original, the 7-Minute Derek, and the Dominoes version, you know what obsession sounds like when it's translated into music. That furious, cascading opening riff, that anguished vocal, the piano coda at the end that drifts away like a man finally accepting defeat. Every note of that song is about Pattie Boyd. Every word is a letter he wrote, and then translated into sound. And George Harrison, her husband, knew. The confrontation came at a party. Clapton, emboldened or perhaps simply exhausted by years of silence, walked up to Harrison and said it plainly, "I'm in love with your wife." George Harrison looked at him, took it in, and then George and Pattie went home together. That night, the friendship should have ended. Instead, it transformed, because Harrison's response to the situation was not rage. It was not a public denunciation. It was not a lawsuit or a tabloid war. It was something far more complex, a kind of resigned, spiritual acceptance that was deeply characteristic of the man who spent years studying Eastern philosophy and meditation. He channeled his feelings into music. At a party hosted by John Hurt, the two guitar gods reportedly had a musical duel, their instruments saying everything their mouths couldn't. Not a fist fight, a guitar fight, which, for these two men, was far more personal. Meanwhile, Clapton descended. For 4 years. For years, while Pattie remained with Harrison, Clapton fell into heroin addiction. He would later say he used it partly to dull the pain of wanting something he couldn't have. His career stalled. His health deteriorated. The man who had played on a Beatles record and written one of the greatest rock songs ever recorded was wasting away in a country house, waiting. By 1974, Pattie left Harrison, his infidelities, and Harrison had many his emotional distance, his growing obsession with spirituality over human connection. It had worn her down. She chose Clapton. And Harrison, in one of the most extraordinary gestures in rock and roll history, let her go. Not just let her go. He understood. May 27, 1979. Eric Clapton and Pattie Boyd get married at a small ceremony in Tucson, Arizona. Among the guests, George Harrison, the ex-husband, the man whose wife had been taken by his best friend, standing there, raising a glass, celebrating their union. If you try to find a parallel for this in modern celebrity culture, you can't. It doesn't exist. Because what George Harrison did that day was not normal. It was not the behavior of an ordinary person working through ordinary feelings. It was something approaching grace. Later, Clapton reflected on that period of his life with honesty that is almost painful to read. He said, "One of my great regrets was getting involved in George Harrison's marriage." He quoted Bob Dylan, "Don't go mistaking paradise for that home across the road," and said that line described his experience exactly. He had reached across a road. He had taken something that wasn't his. And no matter how the story ended, no matter that Pattie had chosen him, the guilt stayed. George Harrison showing up at that wedding wasn't just forgiveness. It was a message. We are bigger than this. The music is bigger than this. Our friendship is bigger than this. And Clapton heard it. After the wedding, something remarkable happened. Harrison and Clapton didn't drift apart. They grew closer. Through the 1980s, they became each other's most trusted musical collaborators. Harrison, who had always been generous to a fault with his songwriting, began writing songs specifically for Clapton. Run So Far. That Kind of Woman. Personal, melodically rich gifts from one guitarist to another. And Clapton's 1989 album Journeyman, one of his finest, is soaked in Harrison's fingerprints. But there's a moment from years before all the drama that tells you everything about who these two men were to each other. Early 1969. The Beatles are on the verge of collapse. The weight of being a Beatle, the expectations, attention, the impossibility of being for human beings who are also a culture institution, is crushing George Harrison. He needs to escape. So he goes to Eric Clapton's country house in Surrey. He sits in the garden. It is a cold spring morning, and he begins to pick out a melody on his guitar. That melody becomes Here Comes the Sun, one of the most beloved songs in the history of popular music. Written in Eric Clapton's garden by a man who needed a safe place to breathe. Think about what that means. Clapton didn't just play on Harrison's songs. He provided the space in which some of those songs were born. That's not a collaboration. That's something deeper. That's the kind of friendship where you don't need to say anything. You just open the door and let someone sit in your garden until the music comes. They also shared the stage at some of the most legendary moments in rock history. The concert for Bangladesh in 1971, the first major rock charity event organized by Harrison, featured Clapton despite Clapton being in the depths of his heroin addiction. Harrison waited for him, delayed things, made space, because some people are worth waiting for. At the Bob Dylan 30th anniversary concert in 1992, they stood side by side on stage, two guitar legends in the autumn of their glory, playing Knockin' on Heaven's Door like men who understood that phrase in ways the crowd couldn't fully imagine. And through all of it, through Patty's eventual departure from Clapton's life too, through Clapton's recovery from alcoholism, through the unimaginable tragedy of losing his 4-year-old son Connor in 1991, George Harrison was there, calling, writing, showing up, because that is what George Harrison did for the people he loved. By the late 1990s, George Harrison was sick. Cancer. He fought it with the same quiet determination he had brought to everything in his life. He didn't make speeches about it. He didn't seek sympathy. He went to treatment. He made music. He spent time with his family. And he called his friends. He called Eric Clapton. The two men, now in their mid-50s, had lived 10 lifetimes together. They had been young men chasing music. They had been rivals without wanting to be. They had been brothers without the paperwork. They had shared a woman, and somehow found a way to share her memory without bitterness. Now they sat together and talked the way men talk when they know time is running short. What did they say? We don't know exactly. Those conversations belonged to them. But we know what Clapton carried out of those rooms: a weight, a love, and a responsibility. George Harrison died on November 29th, 2001. He was 58 years old. Clapton got the call. And according to those close to him, something shifted in Eric Clapton that day that never fully shifted back. Because losing George Harrison wasn't just losing a friend. It was losing the one person on earth who had known him, really known him, since before either of them were legends. The one person who had seen him at his worst and his best and had never, not once, looked away. November 29th, 2002, Royal Albert Hall, London. Exactly 1 year after Harrison's death, Olivia Harrison, George's widow, needed someone to lead the tribute, someone who could hold the weight of the occasion, who could organize the musicians, who could stand on that stage and represent what George Harrison meant to the world of music. She called Eric Clapton. It was Clapton's idea, she later said. He phoned me not long after George died and said, "I'd like to do something." Eric was a very deep friend of George's. I felt confident and relieved. That night, Clapton stood on the stage at the Royal Albert Hall and conducted a who's who of rock royalty: Ringo Starr, Paul McCartney, Tom Petty, Jeff Lynne, Ravi Shankar, through a 2-hour celebration of Harrison's music. And when Clapton picked up his guitar and played "While My Guitar Gently Weeps," the song he had played on 34 years earlier, the song that had begun everything, the hall went silent the way halls only go silent when something sacred is happening. He wasn't playing a concert. He was having a conversation with a man who was no longer there to answer, but whose music was answering for him. From every corner of that hall, from every speaker, from every heart in that audience that had ever been touched by a George Harrison song, that night was not just a tribute. It was Eric Clapton's most honest statement about what George Harrison meant to him. More honest than any interview, more honest than any memoir, because the truth was in the music, and it always had been. So what is the truth Eric Clapton tells about George Harrison at 80? It isn't a scandal. It isn't a revelation in the tabloid sense. It's this: George Harrison was the most generous man I ever knew. He gave me his music. He gave me his forgiveness. He gave me his friendship when I didn't deserve it. And I have spent the rest of my life trying to be worthy of it. Two guitarists, one extraordinary life, shared. One wrote, "Here Comes the Sun." The other played the solo that made the world weep. And neither of them, not once, not really, ever stopped needing the other.